The Adena timeline, excuse me, in the academic record, you'll find 1000 BC to 300 BC. What I'm going to show you tonight, I'm looking at what's called, I'm taking a chunk out of the academic world called the Archaic. I'm saying the late Archaic and the Adena really make up one stretch. That's where my research is taking me. So for me, my Adena world, my archaeology world for them really runs 3000 to 600 BC. And that's what I'm going to focus on. We'll see that just in a bit. Hopewell timeline, again, in the academic world, Ohio is the most numerous for finding artifacts. So the dates of 100 BC to 400 AD is what you will read and hear the most of. However, if you go to Illinois, the archaeologists will tell you it's 300 BC. You go to Tennessee, they'll tell you it's 600 BC. So it depends what state you're in. That's my point. But this is the general timeline that you will see. But I'm saying we're looking at 600 BC to a 400 to 500 AD timeline. And again, this is where I'm looking for my research, right in that area. These are the four prominent areas of the Hopewell. This is their concentrated areas where the artifacts are most dense in the situ. And the provenance that we look at here again is the Ohio area. This is when they start, 100 BC. Here's our Illinois, they call this Havana, that's at 300. Here's our Tennessee area, 6 to 500. And we also have a spot down here in the Gulf at 500 BC. These are the centers of concentration. This year we saw go by that great movie we saw today. This is the Hopewell Interaction Sphere. These are the various elements that come from all this wide range of trade. All this here, Rocky Mountains all the way to the East Coast, Canada all the way to the Gulf. All these things are found in the burials of the Hopewell.
Okay.
It's hard to say.
Yeah.
Mine? Hopefully you.
Come right ahead. Come right ahead.
It came from these other pieces. But it's there. Yeah, you see, follow the data. That's what the data.
Right. What would you interpret that as?
It looks like a Pegasaurus to me.
Stegosaurus.
Stegosaurus. I don't know what else to say, man.
It has an analog in Angkor Wat.
Yeah. Now, of course, now in Illinois, we have this shark, and we have a whale, all from Illinois.
And these
are Michigan pieces. These three here, that's the Michigan tablet story, which is big unto itself. Copper, slate, and clay.
Okay. Well, where was that found?
Well, these were found 1840 to 1920, all lower Michigan.
And upper Indiana.
Upper Indiana. I should say a couple in Wisconsin while you're at it. But nice little bears here. Got a nice ram.
Are these all from mounds?
Yeah, burial mounds.
Yeah,
yeah. And I have no idea what these are for. Anybody got an idea? Let me know.
Yes. We'll see it tomorrow.
Oh, see it tomorrow. Okay, great.
They're like snooker balls.
No, it was a little more sophisticated than a sling.
Good.
I'm in the ball game. What do you make of that?
Chunky? No, chunky was more of a cylindrical thing.
Well, this is interesting. This is a very crude, I hate to say the word lamp, but that's what it was for. You put your bear grease in here, you lay a wick across that notch, and your flame would stand right here. Now notice what John just showed you. Here's that unusual symbol.
Right.
It's on the lamp. It's right there. Square over the upside down, like a table shape. And then right over here, we have the mystic symbol.
Right.
Right there. Can you see it?
Yeah, I can. Go
Okay.
Yeah,
Mystic symbols right there. This is from Illinois. This is not from Michigan.
These are typical Hopewell items that are accepted by academia. This is the 3/4 axe. This is the platform pipe, the effigy pipe. We find copper tooling and we find beautiful pottery. Again, these also represent typical Hopewell artifacts found in the archaeological record. And this right here is particularly interesting because we do find the copper breastplates. I want to say something it's really neat. These copper breastplates, as they're buried with the individual, the copper carbonate from the plate itself preserves whatever is underneath that plate. In this case, it's going to be the clothing that the person was wearing upon interment. If you go to Columbus and go to the museum there, you will find they have a large cabinet with really thin drawers. You pull out one drawer at a time, very close together. They're all lined with fabric that the Hopewell people were wearing upon being buried. And it's not buckskin, it's woven fabric and multiple colors. Yet you won't find one example anywhere in any museum showing Hopewell people dressed in these multicolored fabrics. I don't get it. If you want to see the best ones, you got to go to University of Tennessee at Knoxville. They have the biggest collection of cloth. And I tell you, it's absolutely something to see. You'll just be surprised. It is absolutely gorgeous. Now, next thing I want to point out here, which is really fun, is this guy up here is at Mound City. And when you go into the museum there, he's identified as a bird of prey or a hawk or an eagle. What's wrong with this picture? Why? Isn't that simple? This is a parrot.
Yeah.
So then the first question becomes, well, it's too cold up here for parrots. Well, it is today, but it wasn't then. And we have our Viking and Norwegian enthusiasts to thank for that, because they have developed and pursued what's called the Little Ice Age. We now know between 12 and 1300 AD, there was a whole cold line shift and everything dropped down. And that's when all the castles in England stopped being built. They could no longer heat them. And at that time, England was known for the best wine in Europe. When the cold line shift took place, all the vineyards moved to south of France and the north of Italy. Cold line shift. Simple. Okay? This definitely is fair. Now, this happened, I was at Mound City just about a week ago. I had 55 people on a bus tour. We're just finishing up. The curator came out and he held up this image and he says to my group, he says, can anybody tell me what kind of bird this is? And everybody just kind of looking around, because they just came out of the glass, the museum, and they're saying, well, falcon, whatever. They're repeating the words that they saw on the thing. And then they all pointed at me, well, we think our tour guide knows. So the museum curator, he looks over at me, he says, do you know what this bird is? I said, yeah, I do. It's North American parakeet. He says, you're absolutely correct. And then he gave, this is my reward. I got a big parakeet sticker. You probably can't see it, but that was my prize. So I asked him, I said, well, if that's the case, why don't you go in there and change that? Take that hawk and eagle name off this parrot. He said, well, I'm not in charge. I'm number 2 guy. So there you have it. Okay, just fun stuff that goes on, all right? Copper head plates. We know that these people wore these. They're held on by grommets. These are ear and chin guards. And when you get into the old books and you read them as they're uncovered, they're held on with some type of cloth. So they had a cloth cap where these things were attached, and that was worn as a headgear. And the biggest collection of these is in the Field Museum in Chicago, Illinois. And they don't have them on display. You have to ask for them. This lovely collection of pipes was gathered by Squire and Davis as they went through the mounds in the 1830s and 1840s throughout the Mississippi Valley and the Ohio area. And these, unfortunately, all reside in London. Their entire collection, about 3,000 pieces, all went across the seas. So if you want to see it, you got to take a boat ride or an airplane ride. Again, pottery, very, very nice for the Hopewell. This is mica. Items for decoration. They're just gorgeous stuff, all accepted. And surprise, guess what? We have concrete with a Hopewell. Now here's another funny thing. If you go into a museum run by the state of Ohio, OHS, they will never talk about this. You go into a park run by the federal government, they will show and talk about Hopewell concrete. The guys at Mound City tell us that every mound there had a cap of concrete over the top of it. And if you read carefully in your books, you'll find that when they broke into these to excavate, they took a pickaxe to break this crust to get through. And not only that, some of the places they got to the bottom, they found the charnel houses, which were preparation for burial. Some of those floors were also spread out with a concrete floor. These guys knew how to make concrete. I just got this a year ago. This for me is pretty new stuff. What's that, ladies? Pearls. Let's check out these Hopewell. One group of Hopewell people in Hamilton County, Ohio, collected and disposed of 48,000 pearls in an artifact deposit that was later covered by the Turner Mound. Archaeologists excavated the Hopewell site in the 1880s, found 100,000 pearls Some were inset into bare canine tooth buttons or applied to copper ornaments. Most had been drilled, perhaps with a hot copper wire, strung as a necklace or sewn onto clothing. Pearls. These people like to dress up. You'll never see it in a painting. Now, here's all the artifacts that are found with the Hopewell, but they don't tell you about them. You have to find someone like me or like you that know about this stuff. And what are they called? OO parts, out of place artifacts. Stuff's that's not supposed to be here, but it is. Data. Let's follow the data. Take a look at the OO parts. This right here is definitely a smoking gun. William Connor found this at Chillicothe, digging out one of the smelters. And right here we have a clay mold. This is an iron axe head sticking out of the mold. And what's interesting is here's the plug where it had to be poured in, which means they had some kind of a mobile crucible to do that. This is high-tech stuff for their time. And this is the other side. There's your axe head. All iron. And this is clay.
What's the
Clay.
date?
Can you take the claim?
Yeah, thermoluminescence. Want to pay for it? I'll gladly get you a chunk because I own this. When you go to the furnace sites, we have this green slag that's you only find at furnace sites. It is not created by Mother Nature. So you find this green slag all over the rocks. This is from the smelting process. So we know that these were furnaces. Bill Connor has got over 110 of them identified just in Ohio. Just in Ohio. 110 furnaces. We got no smelting in Hopewell. Okay. This right here is a collection off the Missouri River, right up into North Dakota. Just take a look at that stuff. Look at this. I have one of these in the back of my table. I've got one of these back on my table. And Scott, are you here? Scott here? This piece right here identifies that one that was cast in the back because of the square butt end right here. So it's practically identical. OO parts. This is also Scott's. This one's been cleaned off. This has definitely been cast. This is not hammered or annealed as we talked about the early copper. This one here all these were found this summer, by the way. This one here was found in the river in northern Wisconsin. A little different style. This one also has been cast. All new stuff. And this is Scott's cast ones, all found this summer. And this one right here is bronze, right here, and that's back on my table. Come on back and see it.
This is my nice copper sword. How's that?
So I would.
Oh, that's pretty good.
Yeah, look at that. It's still got the pin.
What?
Pin. Yeah.
Uh,
You don't see pins around.
Native people.
I mean, there's parts of the language on here that's been around since like 2,000 or 3,000 BC. Some of it goes up to 100 AD. So I mean, we just don't know. We don't have any carbon stuff to check. However, clay tablets, we could use thermoluminescence on these.
Okay.
And hopefully be some success in getting a date if they're not contaminated by being on the air, which I don't know.
Can you tell me which mound that came from?
Well, we don't know amount. It's just out of the state of Michigan.
Okay, okay.
27 counties.
And this one here,
Same 27 counties.
because they just get excavated. They don't get
They're pulled up by farmers breaking the land first time.
Yeah.
Is it double-sided, Wayne?
This one is. This one here.
This one?
Yeah. I can roll this one over for you. It's in two pieces. I glued it together because there's the other side.
Where is this found?
That's Michigan.
Michigan tablet,
It's a Michigan tablet, yeah.
and this one's only on one side.
Only on one side. Yep.
What you gotta do, and the big thing.
So what happened to all the Michigan plates? Are they still stuck?
Well, they're scattered in small collections all over, but a lot of them have been destroyed.
But what about the stuff that came right back from Salt Lake City?
Well, it's in Michigan. They gave it to the state of Michigan.
They got them out on display? or-
Yeah, they stocked them. They're put away. You can't see them anymore.
They're
boxed. Yeah, they're boxed. They're boxed. Dr. Halsey made sure of that.
And then we find, of course, this big anomaly. Probably the most troubling is the Hebrewisms, as I call it, of North America. This here is the Ten Commandment stone. This right here is the keystone. Both have complete readable Hebrew. Both came out of Hopewell burials, Hopewell timeline, out of Ohio. This one right here Wyrick was the first guy that found this one here. It's Hebrew on all four sides. It's like the word of the Lord. Lord is God, Lord is King, etc., etc. Totally readable in Hebrew. Here, this one is the Ten Commandments, all the way around the front, the sides, and the back. Up here it says Moshe, for this man standing here. And again, this is just a little clip taken from our early antiquarians. The builders of these mounds south of the Great Lakes and the Great Mississippi Valley in Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, New York, etc., must have understood the Hebrew characters and also understood the law of Moses. And of course, we know about how famous this has become. We got Scott Walter, who now has studied this thing under the microscope. He's pretty much proved the geology of this thing is definitely old. And this is the Bat Creek stone. The Cherokee actually owned this stone. They're trying to get it back from the Smithsonian. Smithsonian told them they would give it back to them. And so they went to get it this past summer in July. They filed the proper papers. Smithsonian refused to give it back. So right now, the Cherokee of North Carolina and the Smithsonian are duking it out to get this returned to the museum in North Carolina. Because the Cherokee, they're going to put this on display with the correct translation that this is a Paleo-Hebrew script. Because when this was on display in the Smithsonian, it was upside down, and they said it was some form of Cherokee. It was displayed upside down. And of course, this guy here, Dr. Gordon was the first guy to see this, to recognize it. Henriette Mertz kind of put him onto it. She felt it was the same thing, so they both realized this was definitely a very, very old piece. I got this great photo from Dr. John White. This belongs to the Potawatomis of the state of Michigan. This is something that they own. It's theirs from their ancient past. When you ask them what it is, they say this is a symbol of our ancient ancestors. Archaeologists have wrote this off as a fancy pitchfork. Okay, I'm telling you, this is legit, guys. This is what it is. These are ooh parts. They can't be here. These are ooh parts. Keep that in mind. This right here is the best news I've had in several years. And Jim Shares, are you here? James, are you in here? Back there. This comes from James L. Guthrie. So Jim came to my house back in 1989. He put me on the quest to go find these things, and I put a lot of time into it. I haven't had a lot of support in academia, but finally, Guthrie, he says, I was both shocked and pleased to read an article. This is by Dr. White, by the way, by a respected scientist, epigrapher, and diffusionist who restated his view of certain suspect artifacts and sites that suggest there is possible value in these finds long before they are scrutinized with greater efforts. Guthrie's article discusses 7 old finds with ancient epigraphy. He makes some interesting points about the relics of southeast Michigan having the mystic symbol in common. The traditional fraud makers are Scotford and Daniel Sober. Some 10 to 20% of the artifacts may be frauds, but many of those could have been copies of broken clay tablets. The important observation is that the content of the alleged frauds, and this is the important part, is often intriguing because of subtleties present that an alleged fraud maker could not have known about. That's at the time. These first surfaced in the 1840s. Remember, in the early 1840s is when Champollion first broke the code at the Sphinx. And yet we find Egyptian hieroglyphics all over these tablets. But there also are other markings as well. And then he goes on to say, such an artifact may be legitimate or a simple copy. Another 80% may be totally legitimate. This is my expectation of most ancient sites. So the point is, this begins to open the door for possibly getting people who are recognized in academia to restudy this work. Now, would you not agree this is pretty neat stuff? Okay? Mr. Halsey, who you saw his face today on here, right? Mr. Halsey? Okay. John will tell you, this is Michigan folk art made by the pioneers of Michigan. The Michigan people, they cleared the land of trees and stumps. They sat around at night and they pulled up this black slate, which is all over Michigan, and they all went to work and did this. And it all happens to match. The guy who lives, by the way, this comes out of 27 counties throughout Michigan. Okay? And we've got at least 10,000 pieces, some estimates high as 30,000 pieces. 1846 to 1920. That's when all this came out of the ground, but we can't say that. I'm not talking about the artifacts thing. Now, we've got some other more ooh parts. This is brand new, just popped up a couple years ago. Guys digging a basement. Was witness, this came out of the ground. I don't know what it is. I just call it a funerary urn. This is very readable. It's just straight text off the Book of the Dead. No magic spells, nothing special, okay? We got this too.
What's it made of?
I can't tell you, we haven't had it examined yet. Every time we get some examined, it costs a lot of cash, so I have to realize that. This is Ushabti. This was found in the 1950s in northern Illinois on the Des Plaines River. And everything here is absolutely correct Egyptian. We did an article on this in Ancient American, compared it to one found in Mexico and to one from Egypt, and side by side. And it's a great article. Great piece. Great piece. And this right here is the sky god, Egyptian Nut. And this was found out of West Virginia. And I got this out of the Jack Ward collection out of Indiana. Again, this was on the Mahonga River, and it was found in 1979. And Jack purchased it from a private collector. So we got Egyptian stuff. This is a beautiful, this is an Adina lamp, oil lamp. This is I got it standing up for picture's sake. It sits on its backside. This is where you pour the oil in. The flame would come off the tip here by the feet. And this comes out of Adina mound. It was marked to be excavated and preserved, but something happened. The West Virginia Department of Transportation mowed the mound down. And this guy, was his name David Williams, he would go out there at night and sift through the dirt. And he managed to find this thing intact, not busted up. And I now have it in my collection. It's absolutely beautiful. I had it here last year. Some of you probably saw it. It's a beautiful piece. And of course, we do have blonde-haired mummies coming out of Tennessee. I don't know if you've ever seen that before. They're in the Peabody Museum. We also now know that hair color does not change over time. If you're buried with brown hair, your hair is going to be brown for a long time. Blondes. And of course, we mentioned cuneiform. This is at Quaker City, Ohio. This tablet was found, and it was validated by Professor, where's he at? David Owen at Cornell. He said this is a 2000 BC tablet from Ur. And of course, and it was already mentioned what the cast-off is on this. When something like this pops up, the first thing you say, well, somebody went over on a trip, and they bought a bunch of little tablets. And they're only 1 inch square. They're real tiny. And he just was out hunting someday, and he had the tablets in his pocket. And while he was hunting, by gosh, he had a hole in his pocket. And this slipped out into the forest. And it was found who knows how many years later. And voila. Okay? These are the answers we get back from all of our OOPARTs. Now, this here we have to go over because I reprinted this book. Now, this is what they say, and this is all legit. This is what's taught to our kids in archaeology. Much more evidence of light tenor, what you just saw, might be presented here as, for example, the numerous instances in which articles of European manufacture have been found. Now, just stop. They're recognizing the artifacts are real, but they're made across the sea. However, have been found in mounds where their presence, now listen to this, could not be attributed to an intrusive burial. So make sure you understand what that means. Someone builds a mound, let's say 1000 BC, they bury a couple guys dead center. Let's say 1,000 years goes by, it's now 1 AD, somebody new moves into town, and their loved one dies, and they then just dig a hole on the side of that big soft dirt pile, and they bury their loved one right there on the side. That's an intrusive burial. So he's saying these artifacts are not on the surface. They're not intrusive. What he's saying is they're found deep inside the mounds. And that's the problem, because they are made by Europeans, but they shouldn't be here. Okay? And this is by, and of course he ends up by saying, who were the authors of the typical works of Ohio? This is Cyrus Thomas. This is Powell's right-hand man running around tearing up the mounds. And I just, boy, I tell you, it just pops my cork when I read this. But his whole work, I've got it published. It's back on my table.
That's a particularly nice broad.
You didn't bring that big one that Lee brought up to you, back up to you. Is that it? Yeah.
These out of Red Cedar River in Dunn County, Wisconsin. And you find these very common in Central and South America, but here we got them in North America.
Yeah, in Peru, the women are constantly spinning with
That's
tourist
it.
traps.
That's them.
And I've never bothered to learn what they're doing.
Yep. Thank you.
You found any gold pieces?
I haven't, but the Hopewell Mounds have gold in them.
Okay.
Oh, they do. Look at this ugly guy. Is he ugly or what? Look at him.
That's weird.
Yeah, just ugly because
Self-portrait.
this reminds me of when they talk about like a wood spirit, you know, like bugs in the woods or somebody horsing around. He's just ugly. Jeez.
Drew Mount, this is his Mounts for the Dead book. He talks about these people, the Adena now, being large. He says two outstanding traits have been noted repeatedly for this group. One is the protruding massive chin and the prominent bilateral protrusions. The second trait is a large size of males and females. Male of 6 feet was common. Some approaching 7 have been found. For example, the Dover and the Cresap Mound. Also, the women were more than 6 feet in height. Not only were the Adena people tall, but also the massiveness of the bones indicate powerfully built individuals. That's the book, Mounds for the Dead. It's all legitimate. This is a Adena skull. This is a Hopewell skull. And here's an Adena jawbone. This right here, this dental mold would fit most of the men in this room. So these guys are broader, bigger than we are. And you can find a lot of this in Fritz Zimmerman's work on the Adena. Let's just keep going here. This was in my last magazine for those of you who subscribe. This guy was actually purchased by the Smithsonian. You know, you'd think they'd have him on display. I drive there just to see this guy, you know, and pay the $5 to get in or whatever it is. But he's not even on display. And if you ask him where he is, I don't even know if they can tell you.
What do they call
He's
it?
close to 9.
What do they call it?
I don't know. Does he have a name? I don't think so. No. $500 man, I guess.
A big tall guy.
Big tall guy. Now, interesting, in our day, in Pennsylvania, there was a group of Indians running 7 foot tall historically. They're called the Susquehannocks. You go to Waverly, New York, or Athens, Pennsylvania, they have a huge hill fort, looks just like a Hopewell enclosure. High up on top, earth embankments all around, and it's right there. It's actually straddles both sides of Pennsylvania and New York. It's right on the line. Got a great museum there, talks about these guys. This is the average size of the Europeans. We found these guys 5.5 foot. Susquehannocks run at 7 feet tall. And of course, what happened to them? Not warfare, our disease got to them. We killed them all through disease. Of course, big guys mean big tools. All right?
Wait.
Big, hammer, I'm sorry. Hey, now, get your mind out of the gutter. I'll go check this out. I've been trying to track this guy down because I want to get the weight on this axe. This thing is huge. Just huge. Big blank. Again, this is all in Pennsylvania. This is mine. This is 17.5 pounds. This is hafted, so imagine swinging that with a handle. This here is an 11-inch Celt. Most Celts run 5, 7, sometimes 8, but 11 is just unheard of, except for the big guys.
Sorry about that. It took my StreamYard to a different link. Let me see what's going on here. Let me try to get it back so I can show you guys something else here real quick. I want to show you these stones. Hold on. Okay. All right. Here we go. Peace to everyone that has come in this early morning rising. I was up, so I said, let me just show this video because it has a lot of good information. And this one, I'm going to show to go along with it. Let me make sure I'm showing the right one. Hold on 1 second, because I don't think that's it. Hold on. Where is it? I think I moved it to. Is this it? Nope. All right. I'll have to go back and grab it again. Hold on a second. I might have closed it by mistake. So you're supposed to be able to think this is the right one. Let me make sure this is the right one, guys. Hold on a second. Yep, this is it. Hold on. All right, here we go. All right, guys, here we go. Let's get this going. I want y'all to see this. And I want y'all to see the size of these stones. This was in 1936, so this wasn't even that long ago. Pay very close attention. For some reason, it will not play the sound. It keeps saying that it's playing. It's saying it's unmuted, but there is literally no freaking sound. Okay? Okay. But just read it. 40 years, wind and rain has carried the loose dirt of the hillsides down. Now watch this. This is Mexico. Yeah, Tomb Raiders, exactly. That's why they brag about that. Not gonna be able to see. Let's see. Yeah, crazy. Look at those stones, y'all. Look, 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 look. This Mexico in 1936. Now, the Department of Interior, they had a whole movie script. If I show y'all some of these things, man, y'all would be bugging out. This is just one of them. But they have so many. Y'all watch, look, they rebuilding. They done destroyed everything, knocked it down. Now they want to try to act like they rebuilding something. Oh, talking about the dirt fell from the hillside, so it knocked the damn buildings down. That's what the dirt did. The dirt and the wind. The dirt and the wind knocks down buildings. That's what we're doing right now. Yeah, for some reason, it will not play the sound. None of them will play the sound. I don't care what video I watch. I remember a while back, I played one showing you guys Hitler when they were killing everybody and pulling them up out of the graves and everything. It had a little sound, so I don't know what's going on now, but I have not been able to hear any of the sound. Look at the rocks, y'all. Look at the massive rocks. Where they look at them, and you know them ain't no new stones. Them ain't no stones they built. Did they build them stones? Are those old stones? Look, he piecing one back together that was broke. Y'all see him? Yep, destroyed all our and look, rebuilding it like they making something. They gonna just rebuild it. Like what? Do y'all see this? Putting wood with the stone structure, anything to make it stand. Crazy. Crazy. Y'all saw those massive stones? Did y'all see those massive stones that you know were there? Yep. Took it apart, moved stuff all over so they could rebuild here, rebuild there, study trying to make them, these other places habitable. Craziness. The craziness of it all. Look at them. They're going to show some other structures. I want y'all to see. Should fast forward. It's only like 8 minutes. So. Okay. Now you see what we just seen, that it told y'all that those mounds had furnaces, cement floors, cement caps. Now that we talking about from umpteen years ago. We ain't talking about nothing new. Yes, recreation, reconstruction, restructuring in the mind, in the physical habitat, everything. Everything's reconstructed. Look. Trying to chisel the building. You seen them? The rock, the big stones, the mason buildings that we know they don't know nothing about. Trying to build and make it another shape, changing the stone structure from something else to another thing. Man, I wish we could hear what they saying. But when I tell y'all, look, y'all see them? See these natives they brought over? All these natives, the 2 times that they brought over to work and rebuild and reconstruct and something of the sort. Y'all see it? They got them building. They got them building and reconstructing everything. CCC workers. They call them CCC workers. So with the CCC workers, while we're watching this real quick, right? The CCC, they were men that worked on the roads and on the trails. Anybody that worked on the roads and the trails, they were a CCC worker. They worked on quarry building, stones with pneumatic drills and transporting or transplanting. So removing and replanting trees, copy pottery. That's what we see, reconstructing of the pottery that was already there, the stones that you already seen created. They repaired ruins. Listen, repaired ruins at Fairview House and inspect ancient relics. They also include views of the cliff dwellings, including views of the cliff dwellings. The National Archives identifier is what we're looking at right now. This local description is moving images produced in 1934. The creator compiled a maintenance of series between 1916 and 76, all from the Department of Interior movie department. Why does the Department of Interior have a movie department? Let me show you something. Let me show you guys. Look. Federal Works. I want y'all to see this. The Federal Works Agency, a work project administration. The domain archaeology, civilians, landscape, motion pictures, the Living New Deal, civilian, landscape, motion pictures, and the Living New Deal. Remember, I told you guys about the gold standard in 1933. So this is right around that time, 3 years after. They were making and creating these stories now so they could fit the narrative of what they were doing when it was coming to stealing your trust so that they can reconstruct everything. Right? Let me show y'all this other one. Hold on. I want y'all to see this one as well. Is this the one? No, that's not even it. Hold on a second. Hold on a second. I want you guys to see one more. Talking about, I'm not gonna, let me see, make sure I can find it before I say it. Hold on. All this stuff going on in 33. Look at this. '33, 36. This is in 33, also from the Federal Works Agency and the work projects. Civilians, motion pictures. Listen, civilian motion pictures. On the theater project, the works progress of administration, WPA theater units present vaudeville shows, comedies, teams, dances, all this going on in 33. All the shows, comedy, dances, all these shows, they reconstructed to make scenes of America. Let's pay attention. All of the reconstruction of making or creating scenes, historical visuals, and production work in these schemes that they created to perpetrate frauds. Check this out. Oh, wow. I can't even believe the sound playing. Well, it's not really playing. Let me see.
Was too
Oh,
small
it
to
is.
support a local opera house. For theater years, all that mattered of the American theater. But today, from one end of the land to another, something
Whoa,
is
it's
astir in the
playing.
nation's
I can't even
playhouse.
believe it.
For the U.S. government is bringing the living stage back to hundreds of communities where no flesh and blood actor has appeared for a full generation.
Oh, say, can you sing, dance, or act? If you can, it's a well-established fact that Uncle Sam will take you in, break you in, make you into anything you could desire. Uncle Sam, he wants to hire actors with dramatic fire, singers who to fame aspire, dancers who can dig but higher. Uncle Sam will take a flyer, which is why we all admire. Say, can you sing, dance, or act?
I'm sorry, I had to unmute. Did you guys hear it? It said Uncle Sam wants to hire actors. Let's listen. Why is the government, Uncle Sam, interested in hiring actors? Pay attention, guys. Rewind that part in case you didn't hear it.
Oh, say, can you sing, dance, or act? If you can, it's a well-established fact that Uncle Sam will take you in, break you in, make you into anything you could desire. Uncle Sam, he wants to hire actors with dramatic fire, singers who to fame aspire, dancers who can dig but higher. Uncle Sam will take a flyer, which is why we all admire. Say, can you sing, dance, or act?
Scarcely a tank town across the country in the palmy days was too small to support a local opera house for theatrical troops doing one-night stands. New York was then only one stop on the road where every stop meant a packed house and a great big hand. Year after year, the road went on supporting the plays it liked, old and new. Unfailing source of thrills remained the New York actresses passing through town in an aura of sinful allure. From coast to coast stretched an endless chain of vaudeville houses, forever prosperous, offering a lifetime of bookings to popular acts.
Hello, people! Hello, people! We just took a Broadway show. Why we were here a year ago with big deal Tommy. We were dancing out of all those dollies. Your attention be paid. And we hope you'll behave. We will sing the songs and we will dance for you too. And we hope you like us. Oh, we get through. Well, hello, people. People, hello. All right, leader, let's go. Yes, sir.
But the road died. Vaudeville gave way to the movies, and there was left nothing but the theater of Broadway, soon to crumble under the worst depression in history. To makeshift offices at Washington, the New Deal summons director Hallie Flanagan from Vassar College's Experimental Theater, puts her in charge of a vast new federal theater project, backed by $6,700,000 in government funds. Early steps in the new project's career are the free out-of-door shows on portable stages that travel to city parks and playgrounds. Old-time minstrel shows are revived for a trial. First audiences are small, on the watch for signs of New Deal boondoggling.
Oh, yeah? What do you know about? I know Miss Sherwood.
Better organization paves the way for better and shrewder productions. Out through 1,500 CCC camps go touring actors in a rough and ready comedy thriller, written especially for CCC consumption.
Oh, what a nice
Enough of this shit. Hold on, I got to show y'all another one. This enough of this one. But I wanted you guys to see this. So the creation, you see that the government started hiring all of these actors, actresses. Once they had so many things established with the colonies, because we're looking at like the early 1900s. So now is the time when they were doing the New Deal, setting up the New Deal and orchestrating stories so that they can. Where's the other one at? Oh, this one. So that they can create these narratives and ideologies. You know, it was kind of a part of the plot and the plan. Exactly our goal. Exactly our goal. Okay. Let's check this one out. Just so you can see. Okay. Public domain, architecture, civilians, Department of Interior, National Park Services, irrigation, motion picture, playground, St. Croix, Virgin Island, St. John, Virgin Island, St. Thomas, Virgin Island. All this part of the Living New Deal. I've told you guys about the New Deal many a times. And this is when they stole all the gold. This is when they were put responsible for your as fiduciaries to control your trust and take care of you. This is why you're not supposed to be, responsible for any debt, because debt belongs to the United States. They assumed that when they took all of the gold. This documentary shows the work of the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, we were just showing before. Camps on St. Croix, St. Thomas, and St. John, and their beaches and palm trees locates and Christiansted and Frederiksted, in the two largest cities of St. Croix. The National Park Service sets up the CCC camp on the islands. The National Park Service is the one that set up those CCC camps on the islands and employs natives for work. Listen, I hope you guys see this. Look, the National Park Service sets them up. I want to put this in the chat for you guys. And employs the natives. Employs the natives for work projects. Who are these natives? I've shown you guys the natives. They told you the true natives were the Teutons, right? The ones that came across the White and the Black Sea. The true natives, right? Let me check with the chat. Yes, exactly. Exactly. See, y'all on point. See? I don't got to tell y'all twice. Y'all know this. Y'all know what's going on. We on point. Yes. So let's get to this real quick. So y'all can see more of these shenanigans. Oh, it sound like it's some sound here too. Oh man, maybe it was something I was doing wrong.
.440 miles south by east of New York City lie the islands of St. Thomas, St. Croix, and St. John, known as the Virgin Islands. With an area of 133 square miles, a population of 22,000, they constitute one of the little-known territorial possessions of the United States. Our first glance of St. Croix, the largest of this group, is on one of the many beaches where swaying palms denote the ever-present trades, winds which temper the rays of a tropical sun and maintain a temperature between 70 and 90 degrees throughout the year. Christiansted, the capital, and Frederiksted are the Danish names still retained by the two towns on St. Croix. Here is Christiansted, where time has made little change in the tempo of life, and many picturesque people and interesting conveyances glide through its many streets. The widespread movement to develop recreation areas in the United States and her possessions with Civilian Conservation Corps labor has reached these distant shores. In one of the old deserted sugar factories, many of which stand as silent reminders of the glorious past of St. Croix, the National Park Service has established a Conservation Corps camp for 100 native enrollees who are doing a big job under the leadership of trained supervisors. The boys start out to their daily task with a quickened step in keeping with the important task before them. Divided into small groups, each having a leader selected from the enrollment on a merit system, they are transported to all parts of the islands, where a diversity of projects, such as tree planting, soil erosion control, landscaping, and playground construction, are well underway. The French, during their occupation of St. Croix, feeling that the dense forests were detrimental to the health of the colonists, burned off most of the virgin timber. And these boys, early in 1936, had planted 15,000 trees, including mahogany, flamboyant, tamarind, coconut, and others. At headquarters, a nursery was laid out. From this central point, thousands of young plants will be taken to beautify the highways and byways. At the agricultural station near Christiansted, these same boys have planted and cared for 6,000 mahogany trees, which a future generation will view on the slopes of surrounding hills and appreciate as priceless trees, not as high-priced furniture. Palm trees lend their grace to many of the country roads, and because of their height, many are destroyed when the occasional hurricane visits the islands. A definite replanting program is underway, and fast-growing young palms are taking their place in line to reach maturity during the lifetime of these men who set them out. Paralleling the work of planting is the effort to preserve that which is grown. Fire lanes are cut through the dense growth, and the clearing is made wide enough to prevent occasional fires in adjacent cane fields from running across the ground. Just outside the town of Frederiksted, on the westerly end of the islands, 15 acres of swampland are being filled in to make a community playground. This area has always been a breeding place for mosquitoes, which menace the people of the nearby town with the diseases they carry. The sound of the buzzing of these insect pests will be replaced by the shouts of baseball or cricket teams. They'll be true sandlot players, for the adjacent beach has generously supplied the sand for filling. "40 miles across the blue waters of the Caribbean lies the island of St. Thomas, second largest of the group, inhabited by 10,000 people. Here, as on St. Croix, fires and the manufacture of charcoal for household use have cleared the timber off the hills, from the heights of which one has an unobstructed view of the town and harbor below. Reforestation again becomes a Civilian Conservation Corps problem, and a camp for 100 men and boys has been established in the hills close to Lindbergh Bay, so named because the famous flying colonel once landed there. 10,000 trees, including mahogany, yellow cassia, and tibbet have been planted on St. Thomas, and over at the nursery they smile proudly as they point to 250,000 young plants ready for transplant. Water is the serious problem at the nursery, where there are no roofs and tanks to catch and store the falling rain, so a reservoir is being built high in the hills behind the camp to ensure the necessary supply. In town, a playground is under construction where baseball players may knock their home runs in the direction of Blackbeard Castle, built on a hill in the background. Broad fire lanes are being cut across the hills to check fires, which are destructive here because of high winds and scarcity of water. On narrow mountain roads, you meet the native worker with his conveyance, which requires nothing more than a sure foothold. Jogging along on the back of one of these useful little animals is not the most comfortable way to see the beauty of the islands, so roads are being widened and graded to permit motor cars to reach the proposed areas overlooking Crum Bay, where one may view the shoreline and the small islands, which add so much to the attractiveness of St. Thomas. For those who prefer the physical exercise of hiking or the solitude of the dense jungle, trails are being constructed far up into the hills, where we may pause in the cool of the prevailing wind and look down upon the entrancing waters of the Caribbean and the lovely form of Lindbergh Bay.
Y'all see the hijack? Y'all see that planet what? The natives planted trees, they had hundreds of people. They had 10,000 people there. They start colonizing. They had hundreds of people that they put into planting the trees and things, everything that they brought from America. And they had to plant it, right? Is this the right one? Make sure I got the right one. I got one more for you guys. This one is, yeah, this is it. Hold on a second. Shock Troop. All right. This will be it for the evening, guys. After this, I want you guys to check this out as well. See, here go with the sound again. Yeah, something weird with the sound. Sometimes it's not working for some reason. The New England hurricane. Listen, watch this. The sound is acting crazy again, but this is the New England hurricane. Check this out. Just watch it. I'm mad this one not playing the sound, man. I'm telling you. Florida. Storm headed for Florida. So, hold on. Y'all seen that? Storm headed for Florida. Check this out. Now, mind you, I'm gonna show y'all again what this is. Shock troops, right? It says the WPA relief operations in New England. Look, it says in New England hits the Long Island, which is New York, right? Mighty funny the sound's not working on this one all of a sudden, right? See how it's doing? Hurricane strikes. I wonder how natural that storm was. Look at it. I think I do want to show one more. Where is it at? Let me see if I can find it real quick. Hold on, guys. I'm looking for this other video real quick so I can show you this. Dang, I might not be able to find it, guys. Hey, let me see. Where's it? Yeah, that's a little too long. Might not have to play that one, but if I can find this other one, dang, I don't even see it. Mm-mm-mm. Yeah, y'all see that? Right. So many. It's crazy. Look at that. Look at this. Man, if I show y'all something, I might have to show you this other one. It's a little long. Maybe I won't show the whole video, but let me go back. I probably will show a little bit of this. I want y'all to understand this too. See this. This is crazy. Let me see. How many? How many? Yep. It's so annoying that you can't hear it. I'm going to stop this one because I want y'all to see this other one real quick before we get out of here. I'm not going to play the whole thing because this one's a little longer, but I want you guys to see some of this documentary.
Wall of water.
Where's this?
The flood of 1948 produced the largest loss of life and property damage of any event in the Columbia Basin. It was catastrophic.
I saw the water, and it was like a wall of water.
was just a pretty bad fight just to stay afloat. 2 babies and my wife.
Vanport was the largest single wartime housing project in the country.
We've had floods, but they haven't wiped out entire cities.
It actually changed this entire state for people of color. This place should never be forgotten. Never be forgotten.
Leading support for Oregon Experience is provided by Arlene Schnitzer and Jordan Schnitzer. Major support provided by the Oregon Cultural Trust, the Clark Foundation. Support for Vanport is provided by Steve and Marilyn Kerman, the contributing members of OPB, and viewers like you. Thank you.
Oh, the flood. That's what people know. The end of the city, but not what the city was and what it did.
In the early 1940s, Vanport, Oregon boasted more than 40,000 residents. The city lived a short life,
I've never seen this one. I'll take one also.
but created lifelong bonds among its survivors.
I'm so glad you came.
Yeah.
And I lived in Vanport.
Yeah.
And it was a city that was made up of a lot of people from a lot of parts of the United States that came together and created the city.
I lived on Cottonwood.
My whole world was Vanport. We went into Portland from time to time, but not that often.
I love Vanport. We had a ball. I mean, we had the movie theater was open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
Well, it just made us realize that having each other was all that mattered in this life.
Born out of a national emergency, Vanport offered hope for the future.
One is the opportunity to have a job, and the other is an opportunity to help your country. It was patriotism that led them to come, and that was part of the glue that kept them together.
Part of the interest in Vanport is people are looking back at that and they're saying, whoa, what happened? Where did all that go?
And how did it all begin?
Portland was definitely not Portlandia in the 1930s. So it was a very conservative city in a conservative state. And the whole tone of the city was kind of, don't rock the boat. We don't want it to change very much. Everybody liked Bonneville Dam because they knew that was going to be important for the economy, but there was a lot of kind of reluctance to be involved in New Deal programs.
In 1937, the U.S. government made funds available for low-cost housing.
The USHA will lend a local authority up to 90% of the cost of a project. Remaining funds are borrowed.
And most cities said, hey, federal money, housing, we can use it, let's sign up.
All they needed to do was to create a housing authority to accept the money. San Francisco did, Seattle did, Los Angeles did. Portland was the only big West Coast city to refuse to create a commission.
And the arguments were it was socialistic, it would be unfair competition with property owners, with landlords, it would lower property values in general. So it was a fear of kind of the economic competition that might come from public housing. And it just didn't seem American to people in Portland.
December 7th, 1941 would change everything.
Congress declared war on Japan. We had lost ships at Pearl Harbor. We needed ships.
And here is one of the miracle men of United States shipbuilding, Henry J. Kaiser.
Nationally known industrialist Henry J. Kaiser was already building cargo ships for the British before the U.S. entered the war.
He knew he could do it, and he knew he could do it fast. So when he set his mind to do something, he was just absolutely driven.
Here is America's answer. It can be done.
By early 1942, Henry Kaiser was operating 3 major yards in the Portland area: Oregon Shipbuilding near St. John's, Swan Island, and Vancouver. As production ramped up, workers streamed in.
A problem arose very quickly that Portland lacked sufficient housing for those workers.
The Housing Authority itself is created at the end of 1941, after Pearl Harbor, when it became clear that it would be patriotic to have a housing authority, not socialistic.
It was very Machiavellian. It looks good, but it basically was for control. And the members of the Housing Authority were rental people, house building people, and so they were looking out for their own interest.
The Housing Authority of Portland, or HAP, began to develop small-scale temporary housing projects, including Giles Lake in northwest Portland and a small permanent project.
Columbia Villa is spaced for approximately 5 families to the acre.
But HAP would severely underestimate the need.
And that's what got Kaiser increasingly annoyed. Things weren't moving fast enough. It's not that Portland by 1942 is not officially responding to the housing shortage, but it's not responding at the scale and pace that's needed.
Henry Kaiser could build ships, but he needed people. He even had what were called magic carpet specials, trains running from the East Coast, from New York City to Portland, bringing in tens of thousands of people. So the workers were basically in trailer camps. Some were sleeping in their cars. Some were sleeping in storefronts. So there was definitely a very dire housing situation.
A lot of the workers were white, but increasing numbers were African Americans. So in a city that had had 2,000 African Americans in 1940, 10 or 15,000 was a huge increase.
Portland can absorb only a minimum of Negroes without upsetting the city's regular life. Mayor Earl Riley, September 1942.
Henry J. had no patience for anything that tried to screen out who might be willing to come and work in the yards. The idea that somehow we couldn't have any minority was, to him, idiotic. Why not? His job was to get the numbers, and once he recruited them, figure out where are we going to put them.
Basically, Kaiser went to the federal government and said, give me money and I'll build the housing.
His son, Edgar, was put in charge of this, and they simply bought land and began construction, and then informed the city that that was what they were going to do.
Henry J. Kaiser bought 650 acres of land just north of Portland's city limits. The Columbia River formed its northern boundary, the Columbia Slough on the south. A railroad embankment rose on the west side alongside Smith Lake, and Denver Avenue, part of the main road between Portland and Vancouver at the time, served as Vanport's eastern edge.
Historically, this area was wetlands and ponds and lakes and sloughs that were all interconnected. Basically, it's where the river spilled over before it was controlled by levees and dams. When the white settlers came, they were farming, but they had to contend with almost yearly floods. They raised levees using horses and guys with shovels, and pretty soon they were protected from flooding mostly.
By late summer 1942, Kaiserville, as it was originally called, began rising from small farms and pasture land.
The story is that officials in Portland were astonished when the bulldozers began to break ground on the Columbia floodplain for Vanport. It's likely that they weren't astonished. They'd certainly known that things were going on, but the public were certainly astonished. And then even more when they saw what the scale of this project that ended up eventually housing about 42,000 people.
400 tenants had moved in by Christmas. Up to 5,000 construction workers at a time, a third of them women, would continue building non-stop through the winter. Plans called for more than 9,900 individual apartments.
It was war, it was an emergency. And so it was built very quickly. It was built using, shall we say, a Kaiser approach, which meant prefabrication in order to do as quickly as possible, rather than using concrete foundations, which would take days or weeks to dry. They simply used lumber. The one complaint I think that is very valid is that the walls were very thin.
It wasn't something that was in people's vision to make permanent, and certainly not in the vision of Portland city officials.
And Henry J. was singularly focused on saying, we're going to build this construction project. We're going to make it as safe as we can. We're going to control our costs as best we can, and we're going to meet our deadlines.
In August 1943, Portland declared the $26 million project officially complete, and the celebration was big. Portland General Electric commissioned impressionistic paintings saluting life in Oregon's modern new city. And Vanport USA was making news for innovative and efficient designs.
Vanport was lauded by a lot of national magazines. It was called the Miracle City. And it was one of those, Kaiser does it again.
Shipyard workers from every state in the Union were now calling Vanport home.
Well, my family is originally from Oklahoma, Stidham, Oklahoma. In 1942, my aunt and uncle told my dad and mom to come to Oregon because there was work for my dad. He was a carpenter. So he loaded up 8 kids and a pregnant wife and drove all the way from Oklahoma to Oregon.
We originally came from Topeka, Kansas, and it was during the war.
We lived in Humboldt, Texas, and my dad came out to the West Coast first, and then he sent for my mom and I, and that was in June of 1944.
My mom and dad were from Arkansas, and my dad was recruited by Mr. Kaiser. Someone had sent a flyer.
My family's from Birmingham, Alabama, and we ended up here in Vanport because my father came out in 1943.
Lived on the South Dakota in the Sioux Indian Reservation, and that's where I was born. Dad decided to go out to Oregon to work in the shipyard, and Mom did too. That's Billy, my foster mother.
Well, the story I heard was that my father looked at a map and said, how far can I get from New York City and still be in the United States, which at that time was only 48 states. And Portland was it.
Have you ever heard of the country western song of the 70s called Okie from Muskogee? That's me.
All strangers, they converged into a self-contained community.
We're here at one of the hubs of Vanport. Over this way was the hospital, and we had the police and fire station. We had the library. We had a bus station back there. We had the shopping center and the post office, and this would have been the location of Victory Boulevard. Activity would have been nonstop. Down at the shopping center, you could get prepared foods when that was not done. It was not available in this country or really anywhere. And of course, you had to pay the bills. So that's what took you to the administration building.
Rents ranged from about $30 to $50 a month.
I can remember it's 2805 Cottonwood Street, apartment 1460. 1-bedroom apartment with 6 people, very crowded. But they furnished all of the basic things for a home and a davano. You could just pull out and spring back, and that was a bed. That's where my mom and dad slept. My younger brother's so little, he slept in a huge closet, and my 2 brothers and I slept in the bedroom,
14 apartments filled each building.
Every apartment had showers, no bathtub.
And there was a community washing house right in back of the apartments. When we weren't playing, we were helping Mom and the family get the washing done and hang it on the line. The lines were strung between the buildings, the clotheslines.
There were ice boxes which they had a counter. On the right side was a little 2-burner stove with a kind of an oven that you had to place on top. And then beneath that was the ice box.
Talk about ice box. The guy used to come around with the truck yelling, ice, ice. My mom said, oh, I need some ice. So she get the money, go down, we'll both go downstairs. She'll get the ice and put it in the bucket and then take it upstairs.
And as a kid, if you had a wagon or if you built the wagon, and mostly we would build our own wagons, and then you would go to the store, and when people would have groceries, we would bring their groceries home for them. We would get a quarter or 50 cents for doing that.
Vanport was a 24-hour city. Buses ran every 30 minutes to and from the shipyards.
There was noise practically all the time because people were getting off shifts, getting on shifts. One of the things that a lot of the residents mentioned was the noise that drove them out. There was a high turnover in Vanport, and part of it was the noise.
The city was never incorporated. The Multnomah County Sheriff's Office provided police protection, and at Henry Kaiser's insistence, the city had its own fire department, but it had no elected officials.
We call it Vanport City, being the second largest urban area in the state of Oregon, but it lacked a city government. It was controlled by the Housing Authority. And when I say controlled, it was controlled. The Housing Authority continued the Jim Crowism of the time by assigning Blacks who came in to 3 separate areas in Vanport. Later, they claimed that they were not assigning based on race, but that was reality.
We're walking down the middle of Broad Acres, and Broad Acres is one of the main streets in Vanport. And you always know that you're in Vanport in the summer because the cottonwoods are just flowing like snow. So welcome to Vanport in June.
In the summer, Vanport was one big playground for kids.
It rained a lot, but when the sun would come out, we'd get outside and skate and enjoy ourselves and play hopscotch.
But the girls always like to get together, play dolls, and all kinds of kids, Chinese and Mexicans and the Blacks and you had German kids and Indian children too.
We had the sloughs, there were turtles, there were bullfrogs, and in the early spring you had tadpoles, and also kids would make makeshift rafts.
Well, I think it kind of looks like us. If it's you, you needed a haircut.
We had woods to play in and a slough nearby, and so we'd play in the water on a hot day. The whole outside was like a slightly ill-kept public park, and so we liked that.
On Forest Lake, there was a big cafeteria over there right on the lake. They had put sand and sand dredge in, so it was sort of this little lake with a beach. You know, in Vanport, everything was sort of like in season. And so we had a season for spinning tops. We had a season for yo-yos. We had a season for just rolling tires down the street. And then the recreation centers had activities of all sorts for kids.
We could take tap dancing just for fun, or ballet, and singing. You could have a little singing group, which was fun. We all loved music. Since there was no TV or anything at that time, music and movies were very important to us.
Henry J. did more than the bare minimum. Doesn't mean he did it perfectly, and certainly Vanport had all kinds of problems. But there was an effort to make it more than barely livable. The facilities were there to have a community with some quality to it, some quality of life.
The schools were probably, I think, the brightest spot in Vanport history.
And the public schools of Vanport, under Superintendent James Hamilton, have set a record that educators all over the nation have come to recognize.
5 elementary schools and a junior high served 6,000 kids from 46 states. They operated year-round and offered morning and afternoon shifts.
When we came, we knew that Vanport had no future except what we built into the children and into ourselves through the experience here. James T. Hamilton.
The Housing Authority of Portland, which had the responsibility for running Vanport, of course, they segregated the housing. And they came to Dr. Hamilton and told him to segregate the schools also. And he says, no way. He said, not in a million years will I do that to these kids.
One of the things that he made sure was that when Black students came into the school, that rather than segregating them all into the same classroom, he deliberately and specifically ordered that they be put into different classes. You had a lot of folks coming up from the South, both Black and white, who had been used to separate schools. And so they were the ones, or the parents actually were the ones who had to get used to the idea. Mr. Hamilton also hired the first Black teachers in Oregon.
This is my teacher, Mrs. Jordan, and that's me at the end. We all accepted as equals.
Bob Matsunaga was born in Portland. During the war, he and his family were sent to the Minidoka internment camp in Idaho.
I'm in front of the dog. That's my father, my sister, my dad's holding my sister, and my mother right there. After we were released in 1945, we had to find housing again. And so we moved to Vanport. We wouldn't be able to buy homes at that time. And I think it's the same kind of experience that the African Americans experienced too. There was no barriers there in Vanport. People felt safe there.
We had excellent teachers. They came for the war, some of the very best teachers, men and women. This is my 7th grade class in 1947, Vanport Junior High, going on about 12, 13. I played the French horn, and with crisp white pants, white shoes, socks, white shirts, with the collar. I loved it. We did a lot of marching, and everybody just really enjoyed looking at us. We were just real smooth, real smooth.
For the younger kids, 5 nursery schools offered 24-hour daycare to accommodate working parents. There was snack time, nap time, and activities of all kinds for youngsters throughout the day. In fact, Vanport boasted some of the most progressive services available, showing nearby Portland the possibility for change.
The Sheriff's Department hired a total of 4 Black police officers or sheriff's deputies. I believe Portland had 1 Black police officer in the late 19th, early 20th century, and that was it.
Another first? The only public library in a war housing project.
Vanport people are especially interested in art and music, and bestsellers are in constant demand. Eleanor Toohey, librarian.
But as the war began winding down, the shipyards laid workers off. Thousands of people began moving out of Vanport, and the Housing Authority began dismantling empty apartments.
The War City can never become a ghost town or a monster slum on the fringes of Portland. Temporary projects will leave no scars on our scenic landscapes. Housing Authority of Portland, 1945.
People in Portland weren't necessarily looking forward to having all the shipyard workers stay around after the war was won. They wanted to go back home.
So there wasn't any real talk about going back to Kansas. Never remember the folks talking about packing up and going back. It was, they liked the Pacific Northwest, and so we were here to stay.
In terms of Blacks leaving Vanport, there were so many housing restrictions that large numbers could not leave.
At the time, racist real estate and banking practices like redlining prevented African Americans from buying or renting in most parts of Portland. For many, there was nowhere else to go.
Vanport becomes a more heavily African American neighborhood in proportional terms, and it quickly gets a bad reputation in Portland.
Vanport was thought to be a very rough city, a crime-ridden city. The Oregon Journal investigated, and they found that per capita, the crime rate was the same in Vanport as it was in Portland.
In 1946, Vanport's empty housing would provide the city a unique opportunity.
The GI Bill of Rights is not a reward or a handout or a gravy train.
Thousands of veterans returning from the war were anxious to start college as part of the GI Bill. But severe housing shortages were preventing many from enrolling.
Colleges arranged housing for students in wartime housing projects. Surplus Quonset huts were purchased, but it was not enough.
Newly appointed Veterans Counselor and Vanport resident, Dr. Stephen Epler, had an idea. Epler helped negotiate an agreement with the Oregon State System of Higher Learning and the Housing Authority to use vacant buildings for classrooms and student housing.
Thus, late in the spring of 1946, Vanport became a college town. Nearly 1,500 enrolled that fall in this unique extension college for freshmen and sophomores. The veterans were home.
Apartments on Vanport's west side had been repainted, repaired, and christened Veterans Village.
I was in the U.S. Navy. I was a frogman, which turned into the Navy SEALs. And I came to Portland and got married and then moved out to Vanport.
Glenn Barnardo studied photography at the college and worked in Portland.
There were just no places to rent in Portland. There were some places, but they were just way out of my price range. And I think Vanport, I think it was $30 a month for a little pad that was pretty much all in one room.
Violet Young was just 20 when she and her husband Wilbur moved to Vanport in 1947.
He had just gotten out of the service, although the war had been over for a while. I went to work at the college. We had a steno pool, you know, so many secretaries there typing away. And we were billing the government for the GIs that were going to school there.
In many ways, Vanport College was giving the town a new community spirit, but negative views from non-Vanporters persisted.
One thing that I remember was a big saying at the time was, well, if you work in Portland and you get to work and you have mud on your shoes, you're from Vanport. They didn't think much of it. And they kind of thought that about the people too.
The fact that Vanport still existed in 1948 indicated that it was not gone because it was still necessary. You still had, in 1948, 18,500 people living there, and there wasn't sufficient housing in Portland for those 18,500 people.
It was a very unusual meteorological event. In this case, there was an unusually heavy snowfall in the winter of 47-48, and the gradual warm-up didn't occur. It stayed cold all through the spring, and then suddenly in May, it warmed up and heavy rains came, and so all that snowpack went at once.
I remember 48. There was the nervousness. There was the nervousness, not that there was going to be, quote, the type of flood that did occur, but that the Columbia River was going to crest and overflow. But at the same time, the concern wasn't at a level that individuals felt panic or that they needed to leave Vanport.
But in May that year, the Columbia River began rising dramatically.
Starting in mid-May, the flow hit about 900,000 cubic feet per second all at once. And it stayed up there for a week and then topped out at 1.1 million. Normally, the average flow on the Columbia will be 500 to 550,000 cubic feet. So it's double. So that's a tremendous amount of water coursing down in a region that is now built up, and there's more property and lives at stake.
We continued to prepare as each day the water level prediction went up, adding on to our crew patrolling the dikes and preparing the sandbags. Both the Army engineers and Drainage District engineer assured us that the elevation of the dikes was entirely adequate to meet any high water. Roy W. Taylor, Housing Authority of Portland.
The Army Corps of Engineers was patrolling all of the levees and embankments along the lower Columbia. They had hundreds of employees out doing inspections and providing sandbags to try and reinforce or armor those sections of levees that looked like they might be in danger of collapse. They could only point out potential problems, but they didn't have the authority to tell people to leave.
The housing authority was being reassured by the people who should know. And at the same time, they were increasingly concerned. I mean, they were nervous, they were worried. They knew they had responsibility for, thousands and thousands of people.
On Saturday, May 29th, a meeting mandated by the governor was called at Portland's Red Cross headquarters, where officials were preparing for an emergency. At the time, HAP decided not to evacuate Vanport, but a bulletin updating the situation would be distributed to each tenant.
That Sunday morning when we got up, there was a notice on everybody's doorstep. And the notice said that there's a possibility that the dikes may not hold and possibility that Vanport could flood. But they also said in a note that they didn't think that would really occur until probably that following Tuesday because the river was still rising.
We were notified that there was no problem and we would be given plenty of warning if a problem should arise.
The dikes and levees surrounding Vanport were now being monitored 24 hours a day and appeared to be holding, including the railroad berm on the west side of town.
The railroad was totally responsible for its embankment. No public agency had any control over it. It only needed to carry the railroad, so whatever it took to carry that weight was all that was necessary because they weren't concerned about it acting as a flood embankment.
The berm was never built to hold back water, but at 30 feet high and about 120 feet wide at its base, it was considered a strong link in Vanport's protective levee system.
No floods had challenged it up to that point. Most people assumed that it was fine.
But behind it, Smith Lake had been taking on water from the swollen Columbia, spilling over North Portland Road and rising at the base of the berm.
Sunday, May 30th. At noon, we sandbagged a boil near the switch station of the SP&S Railroad fill. About 2 p.m., we received another call for a more serious boil near the first. C.S. McGill, maintenance engineer.
The blisters or boils or whirlpools or eddies are where the water is seeped through and they're on the back side of the levees. And this whirlpool activity then just starts eating away.
It was nice, bright, warm day. And I was just out flying the kite out in the open field. And I turned and looked and seen this water start to pour out,
At approximately 4:17 p.m., part of the railroad embankment collapsed.
The flooding water did not go over the top. The railroad berm essentially just melted away, a 600-foot section very quickly because it was so supersaturated, it just no longer had the strength to resist the pressure from the rising river. As it gave way at the bottom, it all just caved in. I mean, it was catastrophic. And there was a Corps inspector and a railroad foreman right there, and they barely escaped alive.
I never seen that much water flowing out of something.
I had my brother and my 2 cousins with me at the movies. We were sitting in there and all of a sudden somebody came and said the dike has broken and we're going to be flooded and we have to get out of here immediately.
No time for conversation. We had to go.
So I ran in the house and told my mother, and she immediately grabbed what she could and herded us out to the road, and we got on this truck and we drove up to a higher level.
No time to go home to your house and your parents. You have to get on any truck or in any car and go right up to Kenton.
And then we didn't let nobody come between us. Mother says, lock up. That means that, we just don't let nobody separate it. Because if we ever got separated, I don't think we would have found each other.
I heard the sirens. I didn't know what they meant. They weren't terribly loud, but then people started yelling in the street, and our parents flew into action.
Out that back bedroom window, I saw the water, and it was like a wall of water. It was very scary. So when he said, get in the car, we got in the car. And as the water came, the houses were knocked off of their foundations, and they were bumping into each other, crashing together. It sounded something like I'd never experienced before. And people were hollering out of windows trying to get rescued. And some people had crawled up on rooftops and were asking for help, crying for help. Hard time. Very sad time.
The sloughs crisscrossing Vanport filled up first, providing a precious 30 to 40 minutes for people to escape. There was one way to higher ground and safety, Denver Avenue, and roads were clogging fast.
Water was probably about knee deep, and we got on a bus and it got caught in the water, and we got off and ran a little ways, and we got on another bus. Well, the second bus of water caught it and started spinning around, and it was moving toward a slough. The bus driver panicked and jumped off and ran to get out of the water, or ahead of the water, and he hadn't opened the back door. And then I just kicked with both feet, and finally broke the door loose. And we got out and was in the water. And actually the bus was still moving, and this lady handed me a baby out the window, all wrapped up in a blanket, and said, "Save my baby." And I guess she thought she wasn't going to make it. And it was just a pretty bad fight just to stay afloat, and two babies and my wife, and keeping them above water.
If you lived in Vanport, there was one way in and one way out. Oh, there was piles and piles of cars.
Hundreds of curious spectators had driven to the site as well, hampering evacuations along Denver Avenue. Others had accidentally stumbled on a disaster and jumped in to help.
My father's name was Roy Ledwig. That year, we were living in Vancouver, Washington. So it was a Sunday, and we had gone to church in Portland. And coming home down interstate, just before we got to the town of Kenton, we noticed many, many, many people walking up the middle of the road, carrying bags of clothes and crying. We thought, what is going on? And we were amazed. What is wrong? Why are these people doing this? So we drove into Kenton and parked, and my father and I walked down to the edge where the water had come in, and he just immediately took off his jacket and he waded out into the water. He didn't hesitate a minute. He didn't even give it any thought. I was standing on the shore right behind my father.
This photo is one of the iconic images of the Vanport flood. Years later, the little boy was identified as Earl Woods.
Earl told me, "I saw your yellow dress and I remember it," because he just flopped right onto my father and had his arms around him, and he was looking behind him towards the shore, and he said he saw me there. And he said, by the time I saw your father, I was just about ready to go under and I couldn't swim anymore. My father saw him and ran out and grabbed him. And he was reunited later with his family.
When we got on top of the levee, I was standing there with both the babies, and this lady came up and said, "Oh, my baby," and it was her. And she took her baby. I never knew its name or anything.
Within 2 hours of the break, 20 feet of water covered the city. That afternoon and evening, boats of all kinds were launched to look for stranded survivors. Rescue efforts continued throughout the night and following day.
We're speaking to you from the Denver ramp that goes alongside of Vanport out here. A KOIN crew left the radio station a few minutes ago.
Anybody looking for a ride in the Kenton District?
You can probably hear in the background the PA system from the Portland disaster car, but we'll try to talk over it.
Well, there wasn't much chance for survival of those that were in the lower stories that we could see, but we made a very thorough search of all those upper story apartments and broke windows and went in and investigated as best we could.
But the Columbia River wasn't finished. Volunteers, soldiers, and first responders had been working non-stop through the night, sandbagging the Denver Avenue dike being undermined by water and debris.
Water's coming through. Water's coming through.
Water's coming through where?
Up above here.
The
underpass. Dike
On-
broke through again.
The dike, is that right? The dike broke through again. The water's coming through the underpass. We're going to have Sheriff Pratt tell you a little bit more about this and the cause of the excitement.
Yes, the underpass we refer to is the entrance into Vanport. And we've been afraid of that all evening, and I've just had word now that the water has commenced to come through, which means that Denver Avenue will be cut right in half just about the middle of Vanport.
And there's a great deal of excitement. The cars are moving back and forth. The police are routing the trucks and cars out because it means that Denver Avenue is going to be cut. So we're going to have to sign off here. Thank you, Sheriff Pratt.
At 9:30 p.m. Monday evening, Denver Avenue broke in two, spilling a sea of wreckage further east. In its path, a portion of Union Avenue gave way next. 3 separate breaks had turned the area into one shroud of water. By now, traffic and telephone service had been severed between Portland and Vancouver. A network of amateur radio operators, or hams, helped maintain communications regionally and across the U.S. Memorial Day weekend had left nearly 18,000 Vanporters homeless, including up to 6,000 African Americans.
We didn't have FEMA. We didn't have all the things that you have in place, today. That didn't exist in 1948.
Refugees were asked to register with the Red Cross for emergency housing, food and clothing, cots and blankets. Nearby schools, churches, and community centers offered temporary shelter.
You've got kids on mats and what have you on the floor at Jefferson High School. The same existed with mats and mattresses on the floor at the church. And I can remember that what we took was the pot roast, because Mom said she didn't know where we would be. And that's the thinking of a mom. So wherever we were going to be, at least you would be fed. And then my dog, I got my dog out, my dog Tippy, and a doll. That was all that we took to get out of Vanport, my prized possessions.
The people that gave us a ride out took us to our church downtown, and the Salvation Army, immediately they started making sandwiches, getting big pots of coffee, and my husband went out on Salvation Army trucks. In the mornings, we would make great big tubs of oatmeal porridge, and take it to the schools where a lot of the people were sheltered.
More than 1,000 refugees were sent to the Navy barracks at Swan Island.
we moved there. If you had a small family, you just stayed in one room. And if you had a bigger family, you had to stay in rooms across the hall or next door. And then we ate at the cafeteria. We lined up for food for breakfast, lunch, and dinner.
Others found refuge in unexpected places.
My brother said the bus first took us to a school in North Portland, and then two families came, two white families, and one took Dad and the two boys, and one took Mother and me and my two sisters. Now, Mother never ever talked about those people. She just said they were white, and Dad just said they were white, and she never ever got their name. And I kind of suspect, coming from the South, they were not comfortable talking to white people, because in the South, you were not allowed to talk to them at all. When I learned about the racial tone of Portland, I thought, wow, those must have been some really good Christian people to take us in like that.
One very important thing, after the flood, the people in Portland were very, very accepting. And I think it's an American thing that if there's a tragedy, sometimes old hatreds are put on hold. And so it was, I think, an amazing bit of cooperation and helpfulness that was going on.
But as the days and weeks wore on, frustration over some of the temporary living conditions grew. Hundreds of war surplus trailers had been trucked into what was left of the Giles Lake housing project, some of them in better shape than others.
And there was some tremendous protests, and one of the signs in the protest basically stated that the federal government could give money to Europe, the Marshall Plan, and essentially they wanted a Marshall Plan for Vanport.
They picketed City Hall because the city itself was then not responding with anything kind of permanent housing solutions, for example, and feeling of neglect. Once the immediate emergency is over, the city's forgetting about us, and maybe the city would even like us to go away.
The first bodies were recovered on June 4th, a 2-year-old boy and his 11-month-old sister. The official death toll in Vanport was 15.
The official death toll is one thing. The number who died is another. Many of the ex-Vanporters believe that was much higher than it was. We don't know. People in Vanport would have family or friends come and stay with them. They wouldn't be registered.
Rumors and doubts about the exact number of dead have persisted to this day.
I think part of it is a distrust and anger at the Corps of Engineers and later of the federal government because of its lack of action, lack of attention, that they must be lying.
I think we were all angry. But what could we do? I mean, it happened, and you just had to go with whatever had been given you.
For me, one thing is that looking at people who are refugees now, I have a little bit of feeling for what it's like to have just everything gone.
It is a miracle that we all were able to get out. I just said, so thankful and grateful that it didn't occur at night, or I wouldn't be sitting here with you.
The saving grace is that it was on a Sunday. A lot of people were not there because it was Memorial Day holiday.
Vanport gave its name to the disaster, but the damage was regional. 34 counties in 4 states were affected. Levees had failed on several dikes on the lower Columbia. The water eroded 100,000 acres of prime farmland and flooded 15,000 acres of developed land.
In the Columbia Basin, as a result of the 1948 flood, there was $100 million in damages.
It is a terrible disaster, and I am in sympathy with trying to get that disaster met.
On June 11th, President Harry Truman came to view the destruction.
There is on the way to me now a joint resolution of the Congress authorizing the expenditure of $10 million from the Housing Fund, which has already been appropriated. As soon as that resolution is signed, which I hope will be before I leave Portland today, that much money will be available for immediate emergency relief.
Truman ordered the Corps to take into account this catastrophic event in its planning for the upgrading of the Columbia River Basin. It justified further investment in flood control. And that might not have happened if we hadn't have had that major flood.
The floodwaters of 1948 receded slowly.
And I can remember getting in the car and going back to Denver and overlooking that pool of destruction, different things floating on the water. And I can remember the stench and the smell, an odor that you kind of never forget.
It would take several weeks before residents would be allowed back in.
We'd go out and a guard went with us and took us to the place where that had been located. This is our house. The roof went down as the water went down. They found our house after it had floated through the Denver Avenue break. It made quite a trip. That's our bookcase. There was nothing.
We found our unit, 2805 Cottonwood. It had just shifted around. And Mother found a lot of pictures and things, and we dried out. I tell you, she made me a red double-breasted coat that survived under that water. That material was still good.
In August that year, people were able to go down there. And she said when she went to her apartment to open the door, she was in shock. She saw toadstools growing all over the apartment. The mushrooms. My mom had to get around there on the floor in the mud. And then she found this pot from South Dakota. She was amazed. So she said, this is going with me. So she took it out there, cleaned up, saved it. That was the only thing that wasn't broken. It's South Dakota dirt, mud, what was made of it. It means to me it came from back home.
The Portland Rose Parade marched on schedule that year. Vanport had a float too. Its theme, selected weeks before the flood, was water babies. Vanport College resumed classes at Grant High School and found a temporary home at Oregon Shipbuilding near St. John's.
It is the college that did not die because they moved downtown, bought the old Lincoln High School building, which is still part of Portland State University, and they are now one of the premier urban colleges in the nation.
By 1950, hundreds of lawsuits involving millions of dollars in property damage had been filed. An Oregon District Court judge ruled out negligence and found no liability for damage from or by floodwaters, a ruling upheld by the U.S. Court of Appeals.
The Housing Authority would like to have blamed the Corps of Engineers. The Corps of Engineers did not feel it had responsibility. It was the lives in Vanport that were really put at risk by the unwillingness for any authority to step up. If anything could have been done differently, it would have been to evacuate the people in Vanport. And there was probably time to do that because it took the river a week to get up to that dangerous flood stage.
Evacuating Vanport with less than 20,000 people could have been fairly easy. But you got to understand that there was no place for people of color, nowhere.
The biggest issue, what people remember, I think the most, was what do you do and how do you integrate all these individuals?
City officials had to realize that they couldn't ignore 5,000 Black residents who had been living outside the city limits They now are going to be inside the city. How are they going to be part of the community?
Rather than saying, okay, wherever there's a vacancy or wherever you can find a place to stay, move there. That's not what happened.
Instead, African Americans were crowded and compressed into neighborhoods in the inner northeast section of Portland, where several thousand Black residents already lived.
Portland created its own segregation. When people look back and say, how did Albina come into existence? Well, Albina came to existence because of the policies that were put in place.
Albina would remain the hub of Portland's Black community for the next 25 years.
Critical mass is a good term of kind of consumers, people interested in supporting particular cultural activities, a population that could support local businesses, could support the vibrant jazz scene in Portland in the late 40s and early 1950s. You can't say that the flood and refugee process built a community in itself, but it provided the basis on which, a community could then be constructed.
What remained of Vanport City was demolished and burned, and what hadn't been salvaged was eventually auctioned off. For the next decade, the site would lie mostly vacant. Portland purchased the land from the federal government in late 1959. Today, the straightaway for Portland International Raceway runs down the center of Cottonwood Street, and a golf course meanders around the sloughs, sharing the land with fast cars. There's little here to remind people of a once thriving city.
We're standing on the foundation for the Vanport Theater. It's one of the very few things that still exists that's concrete, and that is a concrete reminder of the city of Vanport.
I think the connections remain. And I think that's what's been very unique about Vanport. We can sit down even today and start talking about Vanport, and one will mention a family name, or one will mention this, and you're like connected.
We have individuals who've come and they carry with them what I call the Vanport spirit, that we can do things, we can change things.
What's important is that there were lessons to be learned by saying we can have a different municipal experience than total segregation and total marginalization of minority populations.
I'm very proud that I lived in Vanport. I would love to see maybe a house built like the ones were in Vanport that would show the history of this place and also designate the important places of Vanport. We could do it if we wanted to. The city could do it. The Park Bureau could do it. Vanport should never be forgotten. Never be forgotten.
There's more about Vanport on Oregon Experience Online. To learn more or to order a DVD of the show, visit opb.org. Leading support for Oregon Experience is provided by Arlene Schnitzer and Jordan Schnitzer. Major support provided by the Oregon Cultural Trust, the Clark Foundation. Support for Vanport is provided by Steve and Marilyn Kerman, the contributing members of OPB, and viewers like you. Thank you.
These are the oldest footwear that's ever been found anywhere on the planet Earth, and that's pretty significant.
These are before the pyramids were built. People were walking around in these sandals.
In the 1930s, discoveries by archaeologist Dr. Luther Cressman would challenge all ideas about how and when people first arrived in the Americas.
He was the first to comprehend that there were people from 10,000, 15,000 years ago that inhabited this area.
Husband to Margaret Mead, self-made archaeologist, outspoken agitator. He spent decades defending his work. Only now is science catching up to his groundbreaking theories.
He was really a trailbreaker in the archaeology, not only of the Great Basin, but of North America as a whole.
Funding for Oregon Experience is provided by the Robert D. and Marcia H. Randall Fund for Lifelong Learning, the Oregon Cultural Trust, the Clark Foundation. Additional support provided by the Roundhouse Foundation and viewers like you. Thank you.
This desert landscape may hold the clues to an enduring mystery: how and when prehistoric people arrived in the Americas. Evidence of ancient populations was first uncovered more than 70 years ago by University of Oregon archaeologist Dr. Luther Cressman. Over his long career, Cressman's discoveries would shock and challenge the archaeological world.
I have worked here in the Northern Great Basin to describe and understand the way of life of the people who lived here.
Cressman's research began in the 1930s. He believed Oregon's archaeological sites showed that people were in the Americas thousands of years earlier than anyone thought possible, well before the end of the Ice Age.
We know they've lived here for at least 13,000 years, and from indirect evidence, a great deal longer than that.
For the scientific community, the claims were staggering.
The notion was that the peopling of the New World and of what is now the United States was only a couple thousand years old. I mean, like mainly in the Christian era. And that was the going way of thinking when Cressman started his work in the Great Basin.
His research would make him internationally famous and open him to criticism, even ridicule, for decades.
He was accused by some of his colleagues as having falsified his data, and that simply because it couldn't be that old. It couldn't be more than a couple thousand years old.
New technology could set the record straight.
So this is a hearth that we have found in this wall. That is very cool. Canine's what I was thinking.
Dennis Jenkins of the University of Oregon specializes in prehistoric archaeology of the Great Basin. He and his students have returned to some of the sites Cressman first studied 70 years ago.
Mainly, I'm an archaeologist 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I feel a sense of time. There is no doubt. When I drive along the highways here, I see the results of the water that stood here that is gone. Gone. And yet you can see the wave cuts on the sides of the hills.
12,000 years ago, an immense freshwater lake filled these valleys, covering over 400 square miles. The ancient shorelines created wave-cut rock shelters and shallow caves.
It was the fluctuation of the lakes going up and down that created the environment that the native people lived in. And in the dry caves, you could see a lot about their way of life. If something is left entirely dry, then it won't decompose. Lots of plant material and bones and things like that in many of those shoreline caves.
This region is part of the Northern Great Basin, stretching 75,000 square miles through the far western United States. Here, mastodons, camels, wild horses, and other prehistoric animals roamed the landscape until their extinction about 10,000 years ago.
Boy, if there was a mammoth out there, you'd see it. Or a herd of horses, you know. It would be a great place to be able to watch that plane.
Jenkins has spent more than a decade testing Cressman's theories.
I didn't have a dog in the fight. I just simply came here to do science and see who was right.
Were Cressman's controversial theories about when people first arrived in the Americas correct? Finally, there may be answers to the questions first posed decades ago. Luther Shelley Cressman was born in 1897 in rural Pennsylvania. He was one of 6 boys. His father was a country doctor that made house calls. His mother, a music teacher. The family valued education and community service.
Compassion, kindness, understanding, integrity formed the bedrock of the family mother and dad established and nourished. It was in this atmosphere my early values were formed. Luther Cressman.
In 1914, Cressman enrolled at Pennsylvania State College, majoring in the classics, minoring in English poetry.
He learned to read Greek, and they read Homeric epics and stuff like that. I can remember him talking about how fun and interesting it was to read the history of Greece in Greek.
He loved literature, he loved poetry. There was little that he didn't like. He was as much into the humanities, I think, as he was into the sciences.
These interests attracted the attention of a vibrant young admirer, Margaret Mead. Mead would go on to be one of the most influential anthropologists of all time. But in 1917, she was a high school student, enamored with the older Cressman.
She was pretty and charming. They became an item. They fell in love.
They began a long courtship, trading letters filled with poetry.
I remember we were skating on French Creek, and she and I skated together for a long, long time. And I told her all about Antigone, which we had just read in Greek. I recited the whole sorry tragedy to her. Luther Cressman.
By the time Cressman graduated in 1918, World War I was well underway. Poetry from servicemen fighting in Europe stirred him to action.
In Flanders fields the poppies blow, between the crosses row on row. The torch be yours to hold it high, if ye break faith with us who die. Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae.
Cressman took up the torch, joining the military.
He was trained, I think, as an artilleryman, but fortunately for him, the war came to an end before he was sent out.
Cressman never saw active duty, but the experience changed him.
The sensitive among us could not help but find the conflict between the utter brutality of the behavior for which we were being trained and the moral values on which our lives were based. The haunting question of why did I have to kill would not go away.
Luther Cressman.
The war had ended, but for Cressman, troubling questions lingered. He turned to religion, eventually becoming an Episcopal minister, serving parishes in New York's notorious Hell's Kitchen. He also continued his graduate studies at Columbia, where he was joined by Margaret Mead. After a 6-year engagement, they were married in 1923. Free-thinking Mead bucked tradition and kept her own last name.
Keeping my own name, in which Luther concurred, led to endless explanations, on and on through life, and it made a flutter in the press. Margaret Mead.
Their years at Columbia were formative for the young couple.
He was part of Margaret's circle at Columbia University, which was full of the rising young stars like Margaret herself of that day. So he was acquainted with all kinds of people that I knew as famous anthropologists. They were his pals that they sat around and drank beer after class with.
It was a post-war world. Outdated traditions were being shattered in a modern era of films, automobiles, and jazz-age ideas. The couple's tiny apartment became a gathering place where young intellectuals discussed radical topics of feminism, free love, and racial integration.
She was free with her opinions and stated them forcefully. And I'm sure she would have been a very difficult person to argue with.
The pair studied under famed anthropologist Franz Boas. Boas was one of the first to document Native American cultures. Outspoken and controversial, he encouraged his students to challenge traditional ideas using rigorous scientific standards.
American anthropologists would consider him sort of the father of anthropology in the United States.
Franz Boas created what became a standard four-field approach to anthropology, uniting the studies of physical and cultural anthropology, linguistics, and archaeology. These ideas of collaboration would become the cornerstone of Cressman's later work.
And that was a great gift of Luther Cressman, was to be very multidisciplinary, not only in his work, but in his life.
In 1925, Cressman and Mead decided to continue their studies separately. Cressman in Europe, Mead in Samoa. The time apart changed them, and they had both met other people. Cressman began questioning his religious beliefs and dedication to the ministry.
And so he didn't think he was a proper minister anymore, and so he resigned and he became a college professor.
After 4 years of marriage, Mead and Cressman parted amicably. Years later, in her autobiography, Mead would refer to the relationship as a student marriage, which rankled Cressman.
Well, he just said a student marriage. Ha! Ha! You know. I mean, what's she doing downplaying this?
But the two remained friends.
He had tremendous regard for her. I think he had nothing but greatest respect for her work and all that she did. She was pretty incredible.
Mead went on to write the best-selling book, Coming of Age in Samoa, and became the most famous anthropologist of her time. After her death, when the conclusions from her field work in Samoa were questioned, Cressman spoke out in her defense.
All social science, but especially anthropology, owes Margaret Mead a tremendous debt.
Life after his divorce from Mead was decidedly different. He married a Scottish woman, Cecilia Locke, and had a daughter, Jem. The family set a new course in the far west when he landed a job teaching at Washington State Normal School. Within a year, they moved again, this time for good, to their new home in Oregon. The year was 1929.
Condon Hall, accommodating the departments of geography and psychology, is appropriately named after Thomas Condon, Oregon's great pioneer geologist.
Luther Cressman was hired by the University of Oregon as a sociologist, and while at the University of Oregon, he developed an interest in archaeology somewhat by accident.
In 1930, a rural farmer planting crops near the southwest Oregon town of Gold Hill uncovered Indian burial mounds. Cressman was invited to view the site. He immediately recognized the importance of the finds.
He just went down to Gold Hill and saw the destruction going on as this farmer was leveling his field and did what he could think of to do about it. He collected the remains, the human remains and the other things, made some pictures and sketches and made a report. That was his education in.
The Gold Hill site turned out to be the most significant find in the area of that time. The Indian burial mounds held 39 human bodies and numerous artifacts, including pipes, knives, and stone bowls thought to be 1,000 years old.
It captivated him, and I think it was a life-changing experience for him, because after that moment, he saw himself as an anthropologist, as an archaeologist.
It was huge. It's the thing that turned him from a former Episcopal minister and sociologist into an archaeologist.
Archaeology is the study of past cultures and the way people live based on things they left behind, their artifacts.
Yeah, that's really cool.
I think archaeology attracts people who like puzzles, who like discovery. The job of archaeology is to figure out how things are connected and to figure out what the human stories are that they tell us.
For Cressman, archaeology offered a direct link to ancient people and the mysteries of their lives.
He appreciated the fact that when he handled a piece of basketry or a sandal, that he was touching somebody. I think that affected the way he thought about his work.
He always had stories about whatever he found, and he always could imagine. He, kind of pictured this, and he had that kind of attitude about everything. He was just a good yarn spinner.
Luther was always a classical scholar in that sense, and he had a very romantic view of archaeology.
It was an exciting time in the field. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, swashbuckling explorers were making headlines with daring exploits across the globe. In Egypt, Howard Carter discovered the tomb of Pharaoh Tutankhamun, King Tut, and its priceless treasures. In the Arctic, an ethnographic documentary captured the harsh life of an Eskimo family in Nanook of the North. And in Clovis, New Mexico, the discovery of these distinctive stone points would form the basis of a groundbreaking theory about human habitation of the Americas, known as Clovis First.
For a long time, Clovis was the first thing that we could find that we were really sure of. They're beautifully made. There's no doubt what they are and that they're highly crafted. They've been found associated with giant bison and elephants, so we know people were there by the end of the last glacial age when those animals were still around.
It was believed the people who made these, and many of the animals they hunted, originally came from Asia. The Clovis First model said that at the end of the last ice age, hunter-gatherers crossed a land bridge over the Bering Strait to North America. Then they traveled far inland along an ice-free corridor to the interior of the continent, slowly spreading out across the land. They wouldn't have reached the Great Basin until much later.
When I first started my career, it was all Clovis First. People used to call it Clovis people.
Clovis First became the accepted theory of when and how the Americas were first occupied. But there were always other ideas about the date and route of the earliest people. There just wasn't enough evidence to form an accepted theory.
The real problem with early stuff is that you had much smaller populations. You have fewer people scattered over a large area of the landscape. And so your sample just gets tinier and tinier and tinier the further back in the time you go.
At the same time the Clovis theory was just taking hold with scientists across the country, in the far west, Luther Cressman was developing some theories of his own.
He was willing, even in the 1930s, to claim that people had been out here in the Great Basin since the end of the glacial age. Luther had a broad idea of that, but nothing like the technical expertise that we have now.
For Cressman, his first real archaeological work out in the field began with a study of rock art.
We don't really know what these mean anymore because the people who created them are gone, and each one is specific to the person that created them.
Harry Choctu is the Director of Culture and Heritage for the Klamath Tribes.
We have places in the southern part of our territories where they're in the thousands.
In archaeology, rock art is human-made markings placed on natural stone. They exist all over the world, dating back tens of thousands of years. Petroglyphs are rock carvings, while pictographs are paintings. Oregon has both. But in the 1930s, no one had documented them. Cressman took on the project. Over a period of 3 years, he visited every site he could find.
The way he did that was to draft a letter to postmasters throughout the state.
He said that was a sociological technique of the day, was to choose postmasters for informants because they were kind of evenly spread and they knew everything that was going on in the community, more or less.
In the 1930s, archaeology of the far west was virtually unexplored, and Cressman's expedition had the promise of high adventure.
A graduate student, Howard Stafford, and I drove between 2,100 and 2,500 miles in my Model A and made a very large collection of photographs of petroglyphs.
This was an area that was all dirt roads. Eastern Oregon had 2 paved roads.
Much of the state's rock art is hidden in this desolate landscape, known as Oregon's Outback.
People came here to settle in the early 1900s to homestead. People just wore out. They left. And they left these little houses out here on the desert. So when Cressman came out here, these little buildings and dozens of others had been pretty well just abandoned by people by that time.
Cressman used these deserted buildings as campsites while he explored the region's treasures.
You kind of get this picture of a real expedition. I mean, this was going to do archaeology in the Old West. Cressman's got, a hog leg on, in a holster, and he hated snakes. And he was, I guess he would shoot rattlesnakes with that gun. And I've often thought, boy, he's more in danger of shooting himself than he was of being bitten by a snake.
Cressman explored the entire state, meeting with locals and learning the land. In 1937, he published Petroglyphs of Oregon, documenting 60 sites with rock art.
Well, we have more than 1,000 sites in Lake County, so he missed a few. He thought he'd got them all.
Still, Luther Cressman was making a name for himself. No one else was doing this type of work in the region, and the university supported him.
Luther is kind of a self-made anthropologist. He was given permission to form an anthropology department. That's where the U of O anthropology department came from.
Within his first years at the university, Cressman became the region's expert, and he and his students had autonomy throughout the state.
So here he was suddenly 5 years, 6 years after he'd been here, he was department head of his own one-man department and director of the Museum of Natural History and director of the Museum of Anthropology. So he was suddenly in the midst of it. He wanted to be the boss.
But he also had learned the importance of seeking help from experts in other fields, and he drew on a wide variety of sources.
People who studied the natural plants and animals, the pollen rain, the volcanic ash falls, the lake terraces, all of those things. Luther worked with those people.
And that kind of collaboration with many different disciplines was something that was a hallmark of his work. It was breaking new ground as to how to do archaeology the right way.
He also consulted with local Native American tribes who retained a wealth of knowledge about traditional Aboriginal culture.
If we look at the cultures of the American Indians, we'll find that in different areas they concentrated on different kinds of materials for their tools, instruments, and so on. And these not only served that purpose, but they also served as a medium for artistic expression. In the Great Basin, the Indians concentrated on basketry almost entirely.
He was very good at establishing a relationship and realizing that it's the people. Study the people first. Build that relationship, and the science will come.
In the early 20th century, the official government policy towards tribal people was assimilation.
At the time Cressman was working, archaeologists really didn't pay any attention to Native Americans as people.
Today, the Native American Graves Protection Act requires consultation and repatriation of human remains and burial items recovered on archaeological sites. Tribes argue prehistoric remains belong to their ancestors and shouldn't be studied.
We never were removed from our Aboriginal territories.
The Klamath tribes believe they have lived on this land from time immemorial.
Our creation stories say we were created right here by our Creator.
And artifacts indicate their ancestors have lived here for thousands of years. Baskets, like these, have been made in the same unique style, in the same region, since prehistoric times. It's tantalizing evidence of a direct link between the modern Indian tribes and some of the first people to live in the Americas.
There is a continuity of that tradition that extends through 9,000 plus years that I don't think is matched anywhere in the world. I think it's pretty remarkable.
If you could live in one place in the northern Great Basin at the end of the Ice Age, this would have been one of the very best places to be, just an abundance of resources.
Evidence of the ancient people who lived here still exists, preserved and hidden away in these caves for thousands of years.
Before Luther Cressman got here, people were finding things, and people had things in private collections. But a lot of things probably were just, neat things on the ground that local residents picked up and went, wow, that's cool. I'm going to take it home, probably like a lot of us would have done at the time.
Some of the amateurs actually are very responsible people and so forth, but there are an awful lot of them that really are simply looters.
Today, there are laws in place to protect archaeological sites on public lands. That's because removing any artifact, no matter how small, can have a big impact on research.
The smallest thing could be the most important. what it is, how it was produced, the context it is, how it relates to other things that have been recovered. Each fragment or each artifact is priceless as far as the information that it represents.
In the 1930s, artifacts were still easily found in the rural deserts, and Cressman was determined to protect and study them.
He recognized perishable artifacts, basketry sticking out of the sidewalls, such a unique treasure. And that really motivated the next phase of his work, which focused on cave sites throughout the rest of the 1930s.
He fell into this rich trove of evidence, unparalleled in most parts of the country.
This axolotl, the first one ever found in Oregon, and the only one of its kind that I know of in the United States. It's likely that this type of weapon came to the New World from the Old World, from Asia.
In 1937, Cressman and some of his students began exploring caves along the cliffs of Catlow Valley in southeastern Oregon. They documented the excavation in this film.
He was really very thorough in terms of making a record of what he did. He kept very good field notes. He cataloged things very carefully, which is incredibly valuable.
Reading through his notes in the museum is just like, being there throughout the day. And occasionally he would write down lunch at the cafe in Burns, $1.60.
It was dirty, tedious work done by hand in primitive conditions.
None of this early work of mine would have been possible without the aid of many students. In the early days, these students worked without wages. As a matter of fact, they paid to go along.
The dust is just billowing up all day long, caked on you. You're hot, you're sweaty, no air conditioning.
There were no hotels or running water. Laundry was done with a washboard. Cleanup was sometimes in a cow trough. Dinner was Cressman's pancakes or bean soup.
It was quite an expedition to get here in the first place, bring all this equipment and be able to do legitimate archaeology.
All of their efforts proved worthwhile when they uncovered a treasure, one that gave a direct personal link to the prehistoric people who used this area.
We found one day a pair of sandals that had been worn by some small child. They were tied together by a tie string, and close by these were two very small baskets. They were in very good shape. They were not thrown away. Something must have happened to that youngster and her family. Went out one morning and never came back.
The find was enticing, sparking even more questions. Who were these ancient people? How did they live? Where did they come from?
It's not just the artifacts they made, but the real story is how they organized themselves and they interacted with others. What I find interesting is thinking about what people did and why they did it, how they were able to do it.
Cressman got his first clues to those mysteries when a U.S. Forest Service worker pointed him to another set of caves in the region, known as 5 Mile Caves, later called Paisley Caves.
Paisley Caves became important because the quality of the evidence there is so overwhelming.
The cluster of caves had an undisturbed layer of volcanic ash from the eruption of Mount Mazama. Then, no one knew when the volcano had blown, but it still provided an important time marker. Items below the ash layer had to be older than the eruption.
That became very important because the Mount Mazama eruption was so huge, it blanketed a lot of Central Oregon with volcanic ash. And in fact, there's a veneer of ash that extends as far as the Great Plains.
That eruption created Crater Lake. Now a national park, the lake has long been sacred to local Native American tribes. Tribal oral tradition includes stories of the explosion, indicating their ancestors witnessed the cataclysmic event.
People were here and watched that mountain explode and probably were terrified.
Giant fireballs shot out toward the land of the Moklaks, exploding in deafening booms 5 times in rapid succession. Spewing fire from his mouth, the evil chief ran to the top of the caldera to survey the destruction. As fire and lava devoured the beautiful forests and lay waste to the villages of the people.
The date of the eruption was estimated to be somewhere between 4,000 and 10,000 years ago.
The people assumed that, well, yes, if there were humans below Mount Mazama, Mazama Pumice was late. It was not that early.
But no one knew for sure. But at Paisley Caves, Cressman found evidence that the eruption was much older than most people thought. Under the Mazama ash layer, he discovered the remains of a charged sagebrush campfire. And that wasn't all. He also found fragments of spear points, tools, and bones of animals that had died out over 10,000 years ago.
And I recognized one of them as camel bone. Well, that was a terrific discovery, that we had camel bone here, and that the camel bone had been broken. Obviously, they'd eaten the meat off of it, and it was in this ash. Fireplace is what it was.
Yes, there were Pleistocene animals. Yes, there were cultural artifacts. But what was the nature of the association? Cressman found them together and believed they belonged together, but he wasn't able to demonstrate that in a convincing way to a lot of his colleagues.
That was always one of the main problems, actually getting dates that everybody was willing to trust.
Within just a few years of arriving in Oregon, Cressman's work was challenging the accepted theories of other more established researchers, and that created tension with other scientists and academics. In his memoirs, he recalls feeling attacked when giving a presentation at the Smithsonian.
He alienated people many places, including on campus. I mean, other department heads and things like that.
He was a tough guy. He kind of stood up to people.
He could be an obnoxious so-and-so, which he could. I mean, there was no question about it. And I think anybody who dealt with him would have to realize that.
In 1938, another important find would bring even more skepticism, but this time it would also bring international fame. The discovery was in a weathered overhang locals called Cow Cave.
When Cressman's team got here in 1938, most probably the level of the cave, the floor level was probably about right here. So all that material, including that much cow manure right off the bat, had to be removed.
The cave is near the extinct Tough Ring volcano, Fort Rock, and is now called Fort Rock Cave.
One of the great things here in the cave that you can still see is this line on the wall that kind of stands out, and that is the contact point of the ash from the eruption of Mount Mazama.
It was here, under that layer of ash, that Cressman discovered the find of his career, a cache of about 75 sagebrush sandals.
Now the interesting thing here is that we have a toe flap. The toe fit in here, and careful examination of this sole shows mud encased in it. But the significant thing about this is that it had to be mud, had to be rain, had to be water around here to get mud encased in this. Wherever this chap wore this sandal is none now.
The sandals were obviously ancient, but surprisingly sophisticated. They are now called Fort Rock-style sandals. Over the years, similar sandals have also been discovered in other nearby caves.
You know, you look at them and you can see the impression of a human foot in the sandal, you know, where the heel wore, where the balls of the feet wore. There is really a humanness, I guess, that you can almost touch.
This is a pair of replica sagebrush bark sandals that were created with impeccable detail, almost a stitch-by-stitch reproduction of sandals that were found here at the caves. There's just something about a pair of shoes, I think, that really has a great connection to people because we all can appreciate a good pair of shoes.
The sandals generated public interest. People wanted to know how old were they, who left them, and why.
Looking at the sandals from Fort Rock Cave, we see big ones and we see little ones. And you really get a sense of community. Grandmas and nephews and brothers and cousins.
We have kind of a perceived notion that they were brutes, they were kind of stupid, not so good at pretty much anything, but they were far from that. They had elders dying, babies being born. They probably didn't get along with their neighbors sometimes probably got along very good with their neighbors.
Cressman believed he now had additional compelling proof that ancient people lived in the area thousands of years earlier than previously believed, anywhere from 10 to 15,000 years ago.
He met with a lot of skepticism from his colleagues. It can't be that old.
That finally changed in the 1950s when scientist Willard Libby unveiled radiocarbon dating. The process could accurately date organic material back tens of thousands of years. Libby would win a Nobel Prize for the discovery, and archaeology would forever be changed. Cressman immediately understood carbon dating's potential.
Libby was not an archaeologist, and so he depended on samples that were sent to him, and Cressman sent him a number of them.
Cressman arranged for testing on material from the Mount Mazama eruption. They were some of the first radiocarbon tests ever conducted, finally pinpointing a date on the cataclysmic event, over 7,000 years ago.
Cressman was right. He would show that, look, this is pretty early stuff. You're not talking about 2,000 years. You're talking about 7 or 8.
Cressman knew radiocarbon dating might finally pinpoint the age of the Fort Rock-style sandals, which were found under the ash layer. But there was a problem.
He added preservative to a number of the sandals so that they wouldn't fall apart, but it also compromised the integrity of the sandals, so some of them were not suitable for later radiocarbon dating.
That meant Cressman had to use other Fort Rock sandals found by an amateur artifact collector.
Cressman never talked about that. Cressman didn't dig them up.
That might have opened him up to even further criticism, because they were collected without rigorous scientific documentation.
It's something that some of those people who didn't want it to be so early might well have latched on to.
But at the time, that information was glossed over. Still, the results were staggering for Cressman and the archaeological world. The sandals were nearly 10,000 years old. They were made before written language, before the first known wheel, when almost all people were still hunter-gatherers.
It proved him right in the face of all his previous detractors. They are the oldest directly dated shoes in the world.
These are before the pyramids were built. People were walking around in these sandals in Oregon.
The Klamath County Museum in rural southern Oregon displays 2 sandals. They are on permanent loan from the University of Oregon. The sandals are a treasure among the Wild West artifacts that represent the heritage of this region.
To have such a important and significant object in our display, in our exhibits, is really something that everyone should be proud of in this community. People may not realize that we have such an important World Heritage object in such a small museum. They represent human activity in this area at a very, very early time. And they tie into that debate of the first Americans in America, you know, the kind of debate that is full of controversy. This is one of the earliest markers of human presence in the area that we have.
The peopling of the Americas is a hotly debated topic, one that continues to this day. But at the time, it was even more contentious. In the 1950s, scientists had fully embraced the Clovis First theory, which assumed there were no people in the Great Basin when the sandals were made. Even with radiocarbon dates, some in the scientific community questioned Cressman's research. It didn't fit with the established theory.
The idea of people being here for 10 or 12,000 years was kind of off the charts at that time. And so there was a great reluctance to accept what he presented.
That he knew that these were of substantial age, and to be questioned and ridiculed about that must have been really frustrating for him.
He was very single-minded. When he had written something and somebody came out and argued against it, he was irate always, because once he reduced something to paper, it had to be the truth, so far as he was concerned. And he would defend it to the death.
The sandals remain Cressman's most famous discovery, but he did work all over the state. He excavated sites along the Columbia River, finding tools, nets, and bones deep into the sediment.
If you lived along the Columbia River up there by the Downs, you were living on the greatest fishing site in all of North America. It's a long stretch of rapid water where you can get down close to the water and you can spear and net and otherwise catch fish.
Cressman's work showed people had been fishing in the same way, in the same spot for 10,000 years, providing further evidence for his theories of early human occupation.
He was the guy that learned an enormous amount about this part of the country, and everybody knew that.
He published numerous books and scholarly papers. For decades, he was the leading force behind anthropology and archaeology in the state, and helped draft antiquities laws protecting archaeological sites.
He was obviously driven. I mean, he worked like hell all the time. He was just energetic, always busy, always doing something. He really wanted to know what was out there.
He was always working to validate his theories of early occupation. He studied the link between prehistoric people of the deserts and the ocean beaches, documenting over 100 coastal village sites. He wrote grants funding his research, won 2 Guggenheim Fellowships, and oversaw the University of Oregon doctorate program in anthropology. And he maintained his relationships with scholars all over the country, including his now famous ex-wife.
Margaret Mead came here once, and I remember we were a bunch of graduate students sitting around, and he was asking her questions and she was responding. At the time, you wondered what their relationship was now, and it seemed to be amicable enough.
But after years of fending off critics, he had gained a reputation with some of his colleagues as being cantankerous.
Cressman had a strong personality. He had his loyal admirers and he had his detractors. I think that there were people that he rubbed the wrong way.
I think you'd have to say he was not totally beloved. When I introduced Cressman for a talk one time, and I said something about his being a rather crusty bird, a former chancellor of the state system of higher education in the back of the room suddenly was shouting, "Here, here, here."
When he
We don't stop it on that line right there. The father of anthropology, in archaeology. We can skip the last 8 minutes. They lies, they lies, they lies. Peace, 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 and bliss, guys. I am getting a little tired now. I'm definitely about to get out of here. I appreciate you guys coming through and tuning in to the fabrications, the live, and the history. We started off with a bunch of the history, the reconstruction, and things that they were doing to tear up, our areas and rebuilding and so on and so forth. I appreciate everyone that came through. Peace, love, bliss. And I'm going to drop this in the chat just in case anyone wants to finish this. All right. All right, guys. Peace, love, and bliss. I'm out. Much love, sis. Appreciate you too, brother. You already know you always be bringing some fire too. Appreciate you. All right, guys. Have a great one. Peace, sister. Peace to you, Chris. Chat, family. Everybody have an awesome evening. Grand risings, grand risings, grand risings. Thank you, brother.